Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Sometimes I'm answering your questions. And one of the questions we got in was actually a very, very good one because not everyone fully understands the phenomenon. But once I put it into not this word, but actually regular words, you're like, oh yeah, that happens to me too. Which is this idea of people who are narcissistic and how they engage in something called splitting. So you may wonder, what is splitting? Something you're very familiar with if you have ever been in a narcissistic relationship. It is seeing someone either as all good or seeing them as all bad. There's no version of gray in there. So that's probably the most common version of this. So an example would be you are in a relationship with somebody who's narcissistic, and there's times they say, oh my gosh, you are the best. You are the very best. Oh my gosh, you are so fantastic. And you're like pumped up, feeling good. And then one day you do one thing wrong, something they don't like, and now you're the worst. It's a hallmark characteristic because, again, when you think about what narcissism is about, they're not able to see people as whole human beings. You're only measured by the utility you have to them. So if you are doing and saying what they want and they're feeling well supplied and regulated, things are going their way, they're having a good day, you're going to be part of that all good thing. In fact, I gave this example to a group recently and they really resonated with it. We were talking about a situation where the narcissistic person and you go out to dinner and you get to the restaurant and the person seating people says, you know what? We had this weird thing happen. Well, actually, our best table, the people didn't show up at the last minute, so we're actually going to give that to you. And it has a beautiful view of the city or the ocean. And they sit you there. And then you're sitting there, and they say, you know what, like we usually give the person who has this table a free bottle of champagne, so here's your free champagne. So now they're getting free champagne. And you're having your dinner. It's a perfect night. You have the perfect view. They even get a compliment. You're told by another couple across, or another people across the restaurant, you're such a gorgeous couple. And in the middle of that dinner, they look at you, they hold your hands and say, baby, I love you so much. You're like, ooh, this is sort of like an exciting night. But that whole night, the perfect table, the champagne, the this, the that, it's not so much I love you. It's I love how all of this feels. And you just happen to be playing a role on that night. So on that night, you are perfect because the night was perfect. You might get a little bit cocky thinking like, ooh, this is actually a healthy relationship. And then a few days later, something you say to them, you might be disappointed with something they do or let down by them and you let them know, you're the worst, da, da, da. And you're thinking, that's splitting, okay? Now, splitting can also involve multiple people. So let's say, I don't know, you are in a family, there's 3 siblings, and maybe a narcissistic parent will have the good sibling and the bad sibling. But if something should change and good sibling isn't doing what parent wants, those roles repeat. Each child isn't seen as unique individuals. It's how are people serving people. And then the narcissistic parent creates an interesting sort of structure by letting you know that there's sort of like being the good one and then you get to be in the good position. You'll see this, for example, we see this sometimes with clinical patients. We're working with clinical settings. They have, let's say, a psychologist and a psychiatrist or a psychologist and social worker. On any given day, they will say, for example, let's say it's a psychologist and a social worker. They might tell the social worker, like, ugh, I really don't like Dr. Ramani, blah, 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 and sort of cast shade on the psychologist and say, I'm so lucky I get to work with you. You're so amazing. This is why mental health practitioners have to be well trained, because it would be very tempting sometimes to get pulled into that and thinking you're all that or better than the psychologist. Give it a matter of time, it's going to flip. So narcissistic people split, again, not only because of the not being able to see people in a whole way, it's also partly a regulation thing. Life's easier when things are all black or all white, right? So there's that piece of it. But then there also speaks to how narcissistic people are sort of stuck at a relatively infantile stage of development, because this is actually how an infant views a mother or caregiver, right? The infant views the caregiver that responds to them as perfect and wonderful and smile and great and thank God you exist. And then the caregiver that doesn't show up exactly when they want them to and who can is bad. And as part of normal development, the child integrates the parent who shows up, the parent who doesn't show up into one person. And healthy through as part of healthy development, can even see the gray and understand that this is one person. And they come sometimes, and they can't always come, but because they can't come doesn't mean they don't love me. So that's splitting. And it is why many people in narcissistic relationships are deeply confused. Because they'll say, how is it that I was basically the savior on Saturday and a disaster on Wednesday? It's splitting. And so when you experience it, there's nothing you can do to fix it. This is an interior process to somebody with any form of narcissistic, antagonistic, or really sort of developmentally sort of stuck personality style. You have to understand when they're telling you hung the moon, you ain't all that. And when they tell you you are the worst person who ever lived, you're not that either. That in a healthy relationship, that they can see all of you together as one whole person. They can't do that. So the key is to not take it seriously either way, but it can be very destabilizing. And this is why narcissistic people often, or narcissistic relationships, often feel like you're having multiple relationships at the same time, because there's a good version of you that's having a relationship with them and the bad version. You're you. There are no different versions of you. But the narcissistic person will experience them differently depending on how they're feeling inside. That ain't your problem. So that's really what splitting is. Very confusing, very destabilizing, and very frustrating, but very common in narcissistic relationships. Thanks again.